Welcome, everyone. My name is Hiba, and I work with Pencil and Paper. We are an enterprise UX studio that's based in Canada. Today, I'm hosting a fireside chat with Mads Broth, a front-end developer from Copenhagen, and Kira, the CEO and lead UX designer at Pencil and Paper. So this fireside chat series is actually about user experience, and we wanted to actually talk about design from the perspective of a developer. And that's not something you get to see or hear about very often. And we wanted to talk about it because there's a lot of myths that need to be busted, that developers don't care about UX, developers aren't good at design. We know that not to be the case, and we have the proof to show it. In this series, you can expect that we're going to be discussing some of the most common pain points and things that are important between designers and developers in terms of working well together. We're going to be agreeing on a couple of things. We might be disagreeing on other things. But at the end of the day, we hope that you'll see that there's a lot more common ground between developers and designers than you might expect. Before we jump into the topic for the day, I'm just going to have Mads and Kira introduce themselves really briefly.
Yeah, I can go first. So like Hiba said, my name is Mads, and I'm a front-end developer from Copenhagen. I work in a digital agency. So that means we have a lot of different kind of clients, a lot of different projects, everything from simple websites to e-commerce stores and more complex web applications. We do kind of a little bit of everything. And I've been working as a dev for about 3 to 4 years, mostly in agencies, but also on some product work. And then outside of my day job, I try to help other developers learn from my experiences. And I do that mostly by sharing what I learn and what I think is good to know for developers on Twitter and in my newsletter to kind of help other people either become developers or just improve their development career, land jobs, all that good stuff. So that's what I mostly focus on.
Nice, awesome. And Kira?
And for me, so I'm a UX designer. I've worked lots in the complexity world. So at Pencil and Paper, we've worked on lots of stuff in the biotech domain, working with doctors and things like that, as well as like fintech and other complex things. So mostly it's enterprise software, so people are using it at work, but not all the time. So yeah, we really like to nerd out on interaction and collaboration topics and things like that. And yeah, I'm just kind of a complexity nerd, I guess.
A complexity nerd. First time I've heard of it.
Oh, yeah.
All right. All righty. So let's get into today's topic. Good design decisions are essential for devs. True or false? Who knows? I have a question to ask you both, and I'd like Mads to take it first. So, Mads, in your opinion, what does the design and dev process typically look like in your day-to-day versus what it should look like? So if you can tell us a little bit about how you've interacted with designers in the past, what's worked for you, what hasn't worked for you, versus how you would like those interactions to go, that would be great to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a few years ago when I kind of started my development career, the way it usually worked was that almost all of the UX and the UI design work got done before I was even introduced to the project. So, there was a whole lot of process going on. And then it usually ended up with me getting like a sketch file or maybe a Photoshop file or something. And they're like, here you go, they built this, make it happen. And I really wasn't very included in the design process. And I think, some places might still operate a bit like this. But it makes it really hard because then usually once the design gets to the development department, then it might already have been signed off by the client. It might already have been approved, and it's very hard to make changes afterward. And I think that's one of the biggest problems because sometimes you just need to iterate and you need to make decisions later on, and that's very hard when you just have this entire design process from start to finish before you start including developers. So that's at least some of the pains I've seen previously. And what I think is a much better approach that we're trying to do at my current company is to include developers early on. So basically from the first kickoff meeting with the client, we include everyone on the team. And then throughout the UX UI design process, when designers feel that, okay, this would be nice with some development feedback on this, then they bring us in and we kind of set aside some time for that. And I think that works really well because it's a lot easier to make decisions in that stage, right? And it also helps to create this common language of the project between the design and the developers. So it's not like, designers come up with all these things and then the developers get them and have to figure everything out. It's like, no, we're actually collaborating on everything from the get-go. Even if, of course, the designers are doing most of the work early on, it's still nice to be involved. And I think that goes the other way too. So when later on in the project, when you move into development work, it's still nice to have designers assigned to the project. Make sure they have some time to make decisions and iterate later on. So I think that's like the ideal kind of back and forth, and how development and design can play off each other nicely instead of being these like two different silos that almost don't interact.
So does that help, like being included earlier, does that help you guys with your kind of overall timeline? Like, are you able to start building like the data infrastructure or start kind of doing spikes and things like that because of your design conversations? Like, does it help with the kind of timing and tightness of your deadline?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm working on a project right now where we especially early on, we focused on the relationship between UX and the backend developers, because that's usually where all the data infrastructure, like you were mentioning, a lot of the decisions that are made in UX are very relevant for the backend as well, because how should data be structured? How should the CMS look like? What kind of data do we need? So what that helped us to do was that we could start the backend development and some light front-end development before the design was finished, because the UI designer was still working on it and iterating, but we could still get started. So it just made the whole timeline a bit more like intertwined, which I think is a great idea, instead of this step-by-step process.
Yeah, because you're really under the gun. Like if you just get the full fidelity design and then it's like, okay, well, here's 8 weeks, so just build it.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes, there might be some really small design decisions that will take a lot of time and have a lot of complexity to implement. And just, having a developer early on being able to say, well, we can do this, but it's going to take so and so long. Well, then the designers can kind of decide, okay, is that worth it or not, together with like project managers and stuff. And then, of course, if it's important, you keep it, you invest the time in it. But sometimes, it might just be a tiny detail, and then you just cut it out and you just save yourself a week or something of development time. And you don't get that feedback unless you include developers early on.
So I actually have a question for Kira now. So Mads, you mentioned that you weren't totally happy with how your company right now kind of has the workflow set up between designers and developers. And something which you might, anyone who's listening to this might hear, is that developers shouldn't be involved in design. That's not their job. Like they have other things, that they're very busy. They have other things they need to do. We need to protect the developers' time. And Kira, I'd love to know from your perspective as a designer that's had to work with either development teams that are very, hidden away. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so we've had, because we're like, my default is always like collaborate so much. And so sometimes it's been something that I could swing, and then other times it hasn't, because of the way that like the team was set up, or like they're focused on specific things. And so I've had some experiences where I've had to kind of convince the stakeholder team to give us access to developers, which is such an interesting, I just find such an interesting dynamic, because if you're buying into user experience, the idea there is too that you're buying into collaboration. And I think sometimes that connection isn't always made. So we have to do that kind of extra step. So my ideal case is that we can have a lead or somebody just get into the mix as soon as we can. But in cases where we've been restricted and we haven't had access, like we come in and do a design right when development is in their last month for the release or their last few weeks or whatever. What we've done to kind of compensate for that is to compensate with documentation. So we've just tried to like map out that logic everywhere, tried to say what our assumptions are. Like we're assuming we can do this. We're assuming the data set up for this, or the data can be normalized or whatever. And what I've tried to do, it's hard to put so much detail into it, but what I try to do is be like, this is the priority for this feature. Our goal is to get the person to the finish line, and then point out things that are especially priorities. Because I think, like you say, Mads, like you can do stuff in a lot of different ways. not every single detail of the design is actually the highest priority ever. So that's something because you don't get that negotiation moment. So you can at least leave like a breadcrumb of like, this is what we were thinking.
That's a pretty hot take for a designer to say, that not everything in the design is an absolute priority. It's a pretty bold statement.
It is a bold statement. Yeah.
You know, I kind of see the collaboration between design and development as if you're building a house, right? Then the designers, they're like the architects, you know, they're designing the overall layout of the house, you know, how many rooms should it be, where's the stairs, like all those kind of like big high level decisions. And they also have all the difficult talks with the client or whoever's, you know, is paying for the project about like what should it actually need. And then the developers are more of the builders, so they're the ones, you know, in the trenches, you know, putting everything together. And when you do that, you're going to discover some cracks. Like there's going to be small things that was just impossible to catch in the design phase, or maybe requirements change later. You know, maybe suddenly the house needed an extra room. You know, all sorts of stuff can happen. And that's why you need to be able to make these decisions as a developer. And I think when you get a bit more experience, you'll also know which decisions can you just make like on the spot and just try something out, or which ones do you need to kind of flag and bring back up to the architect and kind of have some feedback and some iteration on to figure out if you're making the right call. And I think that just comes with experience, but you know, kind of knowing where that gap is I think a really key aspect. And then getting the feedback from designers through, you know, once a room is done, maybe you run it by the designer, like, does this look good? Is this considered finished? Then you can either iterate on it again there, or you can say, yep, that's done, let's move on to the next one. Instead of, you know, you build the whole house and then you're like, here's a house, how does it look? And then it's so hard to, you know, go back and start over on smaller details. So just, yeah, iterating constantly, you know, getting feedback earlier rather than later, I think is really key.
Something which, Kira, we've talked about a lot in the past is around UX implementation and making sure that there is some sort of review process, testing process, not just for the developers, but also like a way for the designers to be involved throughout and not just at the top. Could you tell us a little bit about what's your take on basically how far down the workflow the designer should be involved, and what kind of interactions are you expecting to have with the developer once something has been built?
Yeah, when something's been built, yeah, that's really interesting, because there's kind of towards the end of that like life cycle, there's like a QA phase for sure, where we're going in, we're checking the flow, but we should have been doing that throughout all of the stories being pushed, right? So we're not just like come in at the end and then we're like, no, you know, you don't want to have that kind of like gotcha moment for the UX, because often UX takes a big hit in terms of priority, right? It's like, well, it's the features technically built is where we get to. And there's a lot of this like MVP concept where we're really focused on this like minimum, and our like the bar goes down in terms of UX. So sometimes it feels like we're getting like a ton of features, but they're kind of weird. Like they end up a little bit weird, right? So we don't get we're like kind of going for volume sometimes. But kind of going forward in the process, like let's say we do a release, something's released. What we want to do is like long-term monitoring type of thing. We want to have continuous feedback loops that kind of get built into teams. So if there's continuous user testing happening, continuous interviews, with so many of these industries that we work in, especially the really super high tech ones, they're moving so fast that the users are evolving way faster than the software. And so we need to be keeping up with that. So having some kind of user research cadence of, you know, quarterly, this is what our goals are, and making sure that we have this data really will help to continue to do that like wild prioritization that we need to do to deliver the good stuff. But if it's not kind of built into process and built into the team, because like a lot of people can conduct this research, it is not just designers only that can ever do research, right? But the more that kind of evidence-driven thing is embedded, the better results that you end up having long term.
Yeah, and I think also, usually in the UX phase early on, you're going to be making a lot of assumptions, especially if you're making something greenfield, like you mentioned, right? So, but the only way to really know if you're doing the right thing is to test it, right? But you can't test it until you have at least some wireframes. Maybe you actually want to build it first and get it to some users. But it's just important that you also have a method of testing. So you're not just saying, oh, we're assuming this, we got to test it later, and then you forget about it and you just, cross your fingers that it works. You got to actually have it be a part of your process. I think that's a really great point there. Yeah, it needs to be included. Otherwise, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, it's and there's always this argument of like, oh, research, we're never going to have time for it. And it's like, actually, you spend a ton of time arguing on the product team about like, no, I want to do it this way. No, I want to do it that way. But the actual tiebreaker and the most efficient way to get that answer is to not have a conversation with like 8 people 15 times. It's to have a day of research, or whatever the cadence or the amount of time you want to put into it is.
Yeah, I think also just one way to kind of assure that the UX is reviewing, during the process, is to basically have a designer approve something before we consider it done. So we try to do that on the project I'm working on now, where when I think a feature is finished, I've implemented it, I think it looks good and it's ready to ship, then I send it to a designer who gets to review it. And then, we can go back and forth a couple of times, and then we move it to like client testing area where the client gets to go in and offer feedback and stuff. And I think that's a really great approach to catch these things early, instead of, piling up everything to the end, and then you have one big QA round, and then there's no time to go back and change everything, and it would be a nightmare. So just having these small feedback loops and iteration cycles I think it's really the key to have those reviews.
Music to my ears. And Mads, you bring up something super, super interesting, which I don't think a lot of developers that I've worked with, for one, that they've thought about, right? Which is getting the design up to a certain point, feeling confident about it, and then passing to the designer for final approval. And as you both have kind of said, right, that definition of done typically just stays with the development team. That little bit of a feedback loop back to the designer tends not to happen, because like either we're at the end of the sprint or what have you. But I'd love to just talk about that phase right before you would pass something to a designer for final approval. Because I feel like it sounds like you have a certain level of design confidence, right? Like, what you're looking for, kind of like just how to sense check for some visual things, for some logic things, some information architecture things. Could you, if somebody who is like a much more kind of greener developer or even designer wanted to kind of build up their design confidence a little bit, what kind of skills or mindset do you think helps you build up that design confidence?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first key is to not see design as this, completely foreign entity that you don't care about. Like, that's step one, because if you see it like that, well, then you're never going to get good at it. So I think just embrace it. And of course, developers don't need to be designers, right? Like, design is way too broad of a field to be able to do, good UX, good UI, good development. Like, that's too much. But I think just knowing some of the basics really helps you. It helps you collaborate with designers, which you will have to do, and B, it helps you make better decisions for when you can't collaborate with designers, when you just have to make some decisions at some point, which you will also have to. So yeah, I just think that's why it's so great to kind of get an introduction to. And when I say design, I'm kind of combining UX and UI design a little bit, because like I said, it's too broad to get into all of it as a developer. But yeah, I just think having a basic knowledge, also just knowing, what looks good, what feels good, and try to put yourself in the shoes of the user, right? Like, that's usually what I try to do. Like, if I'm working on something and if, this is kind of annoying to use, right? Like, then something's wrong in the UX, and then I can try to think, well, what would the ideal be? Like, how would I like this to work? And then try to aim toward that. I think that's some of the things you can do as a developer, and of course, it gets a little bit easier with time and experience. And I should also say, this is like my personal opinion. It might not be shared by all developers. I know some people who are also like amazing developers, but they see a design, they implement it, pixel perfect, and then they see that as done, right? Where I'm a little bit more flexible. I try to iterate more and try out different things. And when I get a Figma file or something, I don't see that as final either, because I know once it gets to the browser, it's going to be a little bit different. It's going to change a little bit. Requirements change all the time later on in the process. So you're going to have to make those design decisions at one point or another. So you might as well make the right ones.
That's in my course. I think, but I think that instinct of being like, I'm not just going to implement things pixel by pixel, but I'm just gonna like, if something doesn't feel right, I'm not gonna just gloss over it. I'm gonna be like, wait, how should it work? How would I like it to work? I think that's I think that is actually that is being user centric when you, as you said, you take a second in your workflow just to be like, wait, would I like to use this? It's a simple enough question, but like, when you're under like the gun of a sprint, like sometimes you just choose not to be a user yourself, right?
Yeah, I think also just knowing, when are there like small decisions that you can just make, and when should you ask for design approval or get some feedback from someone else? Just knowing like where the line is also really helpful to kind of know.
Jumping off of that, Kira, where would you say that line actually is then? Like, what are some design decisions which you're like, you know what, developer, please, by all means, tell me what, like, tell us how you would like to implement it versus design decisions. And this could be, again, like a UX related thing that you feel needs to be escalated, but design needs to be looped back in because, the implications might be broader than it appears to be at first glance.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's really hazy as to how that where that exactly kind of breaks down, or like how you could categorize those different things. One for me that I would say often could just get, oh yeah, we just put that in, that's fine. One thing that is definitely not a good one to do that with is labels. So I've seen a few cases where just, in the flurry of deadlines and stuff, like a very important navigation title or something gets changed. But when you did the testing, it was very kind of wording focused and stuff like that. That's one that could feel like it's superficial, but it's really not. I would say, if there's a lot of cases where you might be using like a framework that has micro interactions in it already. And, like if you're using material design or something like that, you don't need to do, I would say, especially if the designer's busy or whatever, you can probably implement what's in that design system already in terms of hovers and stuff like that. I know I have a bit of a bad habit of always forgetting hover states, and they're very annoying to always prototype in Figma as well. So it's kind of one of those things that's overlooked. So developers will often put in that thing, or like the active state of the button and things like that. And so for me, I guess like a rule of thumb that you could use is like, if you need to figure something out on the fly and it adds more feedback into the system, go for it. Like, because most of the weirdest things that I found in UX, or like UX weirdness that I've found in products, has been more related to a lack of communication than over communication. Like the thing didn't react. Did it work? Did it not work? Like those are the kind of things that really get users sad.
Yeah.
From my experience.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think especially like you mentioned, like hover effects, small transitions, small animations here and there. I think those things are just notoriously also hard for the designer to prototype well. And it's always going to feel different when it's in the browser anyways. So I think those are where at least the developer can, make an example, like try something out and then get some feedback on it instead of, the other way around. I think that's a nice
totally
a nice thing to collaborate on, as well as just usually, at least in my experience, designs are like, well, here's the mobile design, maybe there's a tablet design, and here's the desktop design. Well, what about all the ones in between? There's a million screensavers in between. I think that's one where you'll just have to use your best judgment, because you don't want to go to a designer and ask, hey, how's it going to look on this pixel value? How's it going to look on this pixel value?
Yeah, totally.
So that's a good one where you're just going to have to look, play around with it and get a feel for what looks nice. Make sure everything is always like aligned and consistent and everything, and then you'll be good to go.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a great one because it's so I've designed different viewports and stuff and then been like, well, we're not using that kind of like, we're not using, breakpoints. It's like this other way of doing responsive. And you're like, oh man. So it's yeah, like whatever technology is being used, sometimes you just don't have any control there anyways as the designer. So yeah.
Well, we've covered a range of very interesting topics, all relating to workflow, to making design decisions, to feedback loops. And I'd like to kind of bring this fireside chat to a close and just have both of you take a minute to recap, what are the most essential things if you're speaking to a developer or a designer that's working on a project? Maybe it's a side project, maybe they're working within a team. What advice would you give them in order to feel a bit more confident with working with either designers if you're a developer or with developers if you're a designer? Mads, you can go first.
Yeah, let me just think for a second. I would say probably the advice I would give to developers is just learn some design, like we mentioned earlier, because it's gonna do you so much good in terms of collaborating. It's gonna improve your hireability in multiple ways. I mean, when you think about it, if you know some basic design and some UX, you can make your side projects or your coding tests, if you're doing those for a job, you can make those look and work a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
And in my experience, those are what will help you get a job. So like for instance, for the job I'm at now, there was a coding test, and because I have a little bit of design chops, I like to think I made it look pretty nice. It has some nice animations and interactions, and I actually I literally got feedback on that was part of what made the company choose to hire me. So it directly helps to make stuff that looks good, and also you should want to make stuff that looks and works well, right? Like I think that's part of the job as a developer. Design is not just how something looks and feels. Design is also how it works, and how it works is the responsibility of a developer. So naturally, that means you should know at least the basics about design. And when I say basics, I mean just stuff like try to think like, who's the user, right? What are their problems? What are their needs? What are we trying to alleviate? Like more on the UX side. And then for UI, just basic of animations and translations and colors, spacing, typography. Just these kind of, of course, they're big fields, but with some very like small amount of knowledge on those fields, you can make your stuff look like 10 times better, which will make you much more likely to land a job. And once you do land the job, like I mentioned, then you'll be much better equipped to collaborate with your designers or make those decisions when you inevitably have to as part of your workflow, right? So I think that's what I would tell developers, and what I would tell myself if I was starting out now. You don't need to go crazy into it and learn everything. Just know some basics, and understand that that's a thing that exists and that you should know a little bit about, and then you'll be good to go, I think.
A lot of mic drops in there. Wow. Yeah. I'm inspired.
How many times can you drop the mic?
Kira, your moment.
Yeah, so just kind of picking up on what Mads is saying. Yeah, it's the job of the developer to make it work, right? And I think from the design side, it's also really beneficial if, as a designer, you can figure out a little bit about how the technical part of it works. So we need to understand how the data is structured or how it could be structured. Like, you need to get kind of deep into those things. Having a basic understanding of just like overall kind of architecture and like what's cloud architecture and what are some of the problems that developers have to deal with. One thing that I did really early on in my career was I had a dev crew that I could really check in with all the time. And so I would be like, hey, I'm thinking about doing it this way. What do we think? Is this weird? And so I thought that would give me a really intuitive sense for how hard things are to implement, which it did not. But for that particular system, I started to learn its quirks so I could kind of work around it, right? So we're working in legacy products and things that already exist really often. Like, we don't always get to build fresh. So really understanding kind of the landscape that you're in a little bit is going to just help you make more of your good design get implemented. And also, it's a nice excuse to build a rapport and build your developer friends. Like they're your teammates that you're working with. So bother them, talk to them is what I would say.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I can easily tell when I work with a designer if they kind of have an idea of the technical side, or if they're maybe fully focused on the design. Especially just small things like understanding how HTML is structured. So when you go from the mobile screen to a desktop screen, that has to be the same content, in somewhat of the same order. You can't just bounce everything all around, because that's not how the web is designed. So just kind of knowing that, and also just other stuff like how videos and large images impact performance. Well, if you just put fancy video clips and images everywhere, well, that's going to hurt the performance, because images and videos are hard to load. So then you get worse UX. Just knowing these things that come from designers kind of experimenting and being interested in the technical aspects, I think really makes a really big difference for how the end product ends up.
By the way, I might not have mentioned, but I was a product manager in a past life, and I have definitely been caught in the middle of like the designer saying, but this is so beautiful, look at all the pictures, and the developer being like, it takes 10 seconds to load.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I think.
And I'm caught in the middle.
I mean, that's just how it goes, and it's hard to avoid it. But I think that's also what makes really good designers, is that they can explore new and creative solutions and kind of like break some barriers, but they always keep the technical feasibility in mind. We have a budget, we have some technical restrictions, we gotta make do with what we got between those limits.
Totally, and that's a great note to wrap up on. So firstly, thank you both for sharing. Ooh, thank you, Ghost. Thank you both for sharing all those nuggets of wisdom. I think this was super, super insightful. I learned a lot from just listening in. Where can people find you online if they want to hear more? Kira, you can go first.
Yeah, so you could follow us on Pencil Paper UX on Twitter. And you can follow me as well, Kira Crawshaw. So that'll be fun to spell. we can put maybe a link or something in there. Yeah. We're also working on a design SOS course, which is coming out. And it's geared specifically towards developers to help them get some design fundamentals in place. And so you can find out more about that at labs.pencilandpaper.io.
Wonderful. Amazing. And Matt?
Yeah, the main place to keep up with me is on Twitter. That's where I share lots of development advice. It's even where this whole conversation, sparked, and like where we met each other. So also I would love to know, like, I love to have discussions on there of, what people think. Obviously, everything I said here was just, my thoughts on design and development, but, I would love to hear other perspectives as well. So yeah, follow me on Twitter at Massbot. And then I also have a free ebook that I wrote to help developers with a lot of the same type of advice that I share on Twitter. So you can get that at mess.fyi/book. There'll be a link to pick that up if you're interested in becoming a better developer and getting some more advice on how to land a job.
Awesome. Thank you both. And thank you all for watching. See you at the next Fireside Chat.